Hello, I'm Michael Short, and I run Culture Works Consortium. Welcome to this week's Conversation Hub. Tanya.
Hello, and welcome, to It's Not What You Say, It's How You Say It. This week, always a great conversation about communication. Most important thing in both our work and our personal lives. If
Indeed.
communication breaks down, that has the biggest impact, I would say.
I think it's how we get everything done, and it's how we receive everything, isn't it? It is how we communicate. So it is often the most overlooked part of what we do in terms of helping clients, and everything we do really is geared towards improving that communication process. Why don't we start off with a couple of thoughts? You mentioned to me before we started an area that you like covering, and why don't you just sort of share that with everybody?
Yeah, so I really like the Moravian theory, and it's still really, I mean, it's very old. It was before I was born, believe it or not. So it came around in 1967. But what Moravian talks about is around, it's called the 7-38-55 rule. And what it talks about is that only 7% of communication comes from the words. 38% comes from the tone of voice, and 55% comes from the language. And that's only really important when there's a disconnect. So if I am talking to you and saying that I'm really interested in what you're saying, but I'm sitting there on my phone and being really distracted and really not communicating, my tone of voice is really saying I'm really not interested in this. That's when the incongruous comes, because actually we know that meaning from the words is backed up by how we say it and how we are present in the room. Yes. And I always think it's a really important one to start to think about, because we all know who has said to someone, "How are you?" and they say, "I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine." Same words, all very different meanings. Yeah.
And that Moravian study also links into a pet area of mine that you know, which is Edgar Sheen and the humble inquiry. And he makes the point in the book, which I would recommend to everybody, that when you're talking to somebody, when you're asking the question, use clean language, another area that we both cover off in coaching supervision. And that's something we ought to drop a quick mention in. We can always do that at some time. But that whole point of, are you asking the question with a pointed end to it, the way you're already trying to feed in your bias, your point, your belief? Or are you really asking with the person to get them information? So why don't we go back to what you're talking about with the Moravian study and take one of the points that comes out of that and sort of further expand, if you want.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'd almost like to go back to the beginning as well, because we talk about communication, but what actually is communication?
Yes.
Yeah. And it's a question I ask a lot, is what is communication? And we usually get, it's broadcasting. Yeah. It's telling people, it's talking. Yes. And I know this is something you're massively passionate about. It's a two-way thing. It's listening. Listening is so important part of the communication, but people forget about that.
Yeah, it's funny when you say to people, when you communicate with someone, what's the point? And they go, well, to make sure they understand, make sure you're telling them stuff that's important to you and hopefully important to them. Okay. And how do you confirm that they've understood what you, and they look at you and go, oh, confirmation. You mean, yes, Yes, you need them to confirm that what they've heard from you is exactly what you wanted them to hear. And
Yeah,
having a partner whose first language is not English, we have some absolute classics where she uses slightly different grammar
yeah,
to say something. And now I've got used to it, and I interpret, a bit like AI. I've got an AI
yeah,
brain working on the communication that she's used. I mean, not that she's a great English speaker, but
yeah,
sometimes she uses a different verb. And so that works really well. But I often say to her, can you just repeat back to me what you mean by that? Either when she says something back to me, or when I've said something to her. It's absolutely fascinating. And clients, you go, so what about the comms part of your message delivery? We tell everybody. Oh, okay. And how do you know that they've heard the message you want them to hear? And you can see the lights suddenly coming on, and they go, oh, that's a good point. I haven't thought about that one.
yeah. And that really, really brings to mind for me that Stephen Covey, the 7 habits highly effective people, but actually the seven levels of listening.
Yes.
And actually, we start by ignoring. That is actually not listening at all, obviously. Looking away, doing something else, not acknowledging. And then we move to pretending where we're probably nodding, just to show that we're listening, even though we're not really listening. And then moving to selective listening. I'm only listening for things that really interest me. So I'm just picking the bits of the message, which is where your bias comes in, right?
Yes.
Attentive listening, full focus, complete attention, actually taking in what someone's saying. And then that empathetic listening. So really listening to everything that is said and everything that isn't said, and body language. So going back to that Morabian study. So,
How do you
listen. Go on.
Well, how do you find that when you talk with clients? What are the sort of stories they've told you about funny things that have happened to them where they think that people have been listening, or they think that someone's been paying attention? Have we got any sort of anecdotes? I'm putting you on the spot. Do you have any anecdotes for that or not?
Well, I think for me, just we're both with my clients and in my day, we make an assumption that people get it like we get it, and this is where trust breaks down, because we
Yes.
have conversations, that we think we've had, but we have no point checked the understanding. So at no point have we gone back and said, this is what I think I have heard. Have I heard that correctly? This is what I think you're trying to tell me. Is that right? So we don't have the two-way, that confirmation of that conversation, which breaks everything down.
Yes.
One great, if we are not clear, we are not assertive. So I talk a lot about assertiveness, and we quite often will say it would be lovely to have that by Friday, because we try to be really nice. We try to put a bit of fluff around what we're saying. So you're thinking, oh, well, Tanya just thinks it'd be lovely to have it by Friday. Actually, in my head, I think I've communicated to you, Michael, that I'm having it. I want it by Friday. But you're just going, well, I'll put it down the bottom of the list, because if I get it done by Friday, she'll be really pleased. But actually, Monday's going to be good enough. We haven't had a conversation about this. I come to you on Friday going, where's that piece of work that you were going to get for me? And you're like, well, you just told me it was lovely. So straight away, we're clashing.
Yes. Yes.
We're straight away clashing because everything's gone.
Yeah. And so just looking at the title again, which we said, it's not what you said, it's how you said it.
Yeah.
I just want to bring in an element of something else there that you immediately was like a thunderbolt. I suddenly thought, we never talk about confirmation bias when we talk about this a little. Well, we do, obviously we do, but it's something that we haven't covered here. And it was just a bit of a thing that came in as you said. I suddenly thought, of course, if people are expecting to hear something, they listen for what they're expecting to hear, not what you want them to know. And I think that piece that you just said there, that experience of, saying to somebody, for example, I've been in a position running companies where I've said to people, we're going to have to stretch the sales budget next year, or we're going to have to reduce the operational budget this year. And there's quite often, I'm sure because you've done it as well in general management, there's a sense going around, oh, they're going to ask for a 15%, variable cost cut this year. And so you go into the meeting and you say, right, I'd like a 20% variable cost cut. And no one hears 20%. No, nobody absolutely hears. So you actually have to say, just out of interest, can you just repeat back to me what you think I said about variable cost cutting? And inevitably you'll get not the right answer, and you'll get their confirmational bias of what they were thinking it was going to be quite often coming back at you. And I find that whole thing about when you're communicating, are you doing much are you doing much to ensure that there isn't confirmational bias in you, but more importantly in the audience, because they're expecting to hear a certain message? And we also do a lot of work in that area, helping people to structure how you say things in a way that doesn't fit an old pattern and allows people to hear anew rather than hear something that they may have expected or seen of old.
I think that comes back to assertiveness as well, doesn't it? Because actually, if you'd said, we're going to have to cut it by 20% in that first conversation, and you may not have known it at that time, straight away we've been assertive. We've said what it is. We all write our own stories over the top of things. That's just life. So if you talk to me about something that's happened to you, that something similar has happened to me, I'm probably writing my own story over what you've said. And I have stopped listening to you because I'm going, oh, yeah, that happened. And this is what happened to me. And this is what I did. And I've actually stopped listening because what I've listened to, I'm not actively listening anymore, because I've started to write my story. And actually, our natural listening style is around listening to answer, not listening to understand. And that's natural. That is where we mostly sit.
That is so true, that people seek to, as you just said, rather than to listen, they're thinking, sitting there thinking to answer. And the bias people have is that they don't hear anything that follows the point they want to answer. They're now framing their own response, and they're not listening to the rest of the question. So you might well have said, we're going to have an operational budget cut on variable cost of 20%. And then you might go on to say, for the next 3 months, and then we hope to release in the meantime, they're not listening to the rest of the conversation. They've already gone to, how can I answer this? What am I going to do? And so it's interesting to think about how you introduce concepts of confirmation of understanding, and how you introduce the concept of breaking up that communication. How you said it. Well, did you download Tolstoy's War and Peace, or did you give people things? We used to have this phrase, bite-size communication that we used in Agile. And it's fascinating where, if you give people too much, they're gone. They're not listening because it's too much. And that's another thing that you've just reminded me of. Sit here having, that's what I love about conversation. How you start the chat and then you wander off. I think people think we must script all this. We don't. We have some ideas. We just don't walk into the studio completely empty-minded. But it's a conversation that is our experience. It brings out ideas, and that. Have you broken it down enough? Have you given people an opportunity to create hooks in their mind for the subjects you are addressing with them? Exactly what you just said, in terms of people thinking about how they're going to answer it, because they're going to forget the other 2/3 of what you wanted them to hear.
Yeah. And I think, that's why it's worth having regular check-ins as you go through it, particularly if it is a big message. So this is where we are, right? Any questions at this point? Let's confirm everyone understand where we are with that. Okay, let's move to the next thing, because too much information does become a fog in most people's minds. So actually that constant checking in and checking of understanding makes a massive difference. And you know what? I'm massively solutions orientated. I've had to really work hard to actively listen. Really work hard. And I think, you bring the word bias up. We all have bias. That is just life. We all have bias. It's just recognizing when we bring it in and what does that do to the conversation. And, for bias, it's just recognizing, is it logical? Does it make sense at this point? Our bias is there to protect us usually, but actually we hold on to stuff that is not useful for us and actually makes decisions really hard. So we all have bias. That's just life. It's just recognizing and unpicking when it doesn't make sense to use it.
Yeah, that bias is also something in presentation style, isn't it? That Moravian talked about, and we talked in the past about assertive communication. What is it? And we talked about the 3 states: passive, aggressive, and assertive. What's your take on the sort of assertive communication piece? What is it that you might want to define it, but what's so important about it, do you think, when people go through this process?
Yeah, so I think my experience is that people get aggressive and assertive mixed up. And assertive is a 2-way conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Assertiveness is very much talking about, what do I need and want?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean I am getting my own way and that I am right.
Mm-hmm.
It is then working with the other person to have that conversation. So it could be, let's take it. One of the things I loved talking about when we talk about assertiveness is, there are 2 chefs in the kitchen. They both need a lemon for their recipe, and there is 1 lemon. They have a massive argument about who's having this lemon. And actually, if they had been assertive and said, I need the rind of this lemon, chef 1, chef 2, I need the juice of the lemon, they could have used the same lemon, because they needed different parts of that lemon. But because they just said, I need a lemon, they didn't have a really good conversation. So it's as easy as me saying to you, Michael, I need this by Friday at 3:00. You might turn around and say, Tanya, I can't do that because these are my priorities. Can I either drop something, or can you have this on Monday at 2:00? That is great assertive conversation between both of us. I've told you what I need. You've told me actually you can't deliver it unless you do something else. That is an assertive conversation. An aggressive conversation would be, Michael, I need that by 2:00. Bye. Done.
Yeah, I fundamentally
No one
find
wins in
that. Yeah, it's that sort of. It's giving both parties the opportunity to, as you said, really communicate what they need, and for the other person to really listen to what that need is. And it comes back to that humbleness again, isn't it? It's your job is to understand, or to seek to understand before being understood, which is the other Covey thing that we often find with clients. And getting people to put things in language that is clear and precise without being aggressive. So, as you said, it's no good saying to someone, I need an onion, I need an onion, I need a lemon, and that's mine. Well, that's not helpful. Saying to somebody, for the being precise, but being humble and saying, well, we both need a lemon by the sounds of it. What is your need within that? We're being silly now in terms of breaking this down, but what is your need? You know, so as you just said, I must have this by close of play on Friday. Okay, I've got 5 things I need to get done. It's maybe Thursday morning. What are the things that you would like me to deprioritize? Something else that we often get into with clients is, what is the priority? If someone is saying, and we talk about time boxes and all sorts of things, but which we can come on to, and please come back to us if you want to know more about those sort of things. But what exactly is it that you need by when, and who are you asking? Not telling, who are you asking to do it for you? And have you really understood what their stresses and strains and commitments are? Because if you don't, if you haven't looked to how have you said what you've asked for, then it can lead to aggression when it doesn't need to be aggressive, and it can lead to misunderstanding when there's no need for it to be misunderstood. And that's that, as you said, it's a fantastic area to explore with people, and that tends to come out in personal coaching. Do you find that sort of getting people to change how they are?
Yeah, I think it for me, it's getting people to understand the impact. What is the impact of not being clear? What is the impact? So actually, it's, for me, it's around building psychological safety, trusting relationships, because actually assertiveness does that. If we are assertive and we are able to express our needs, our thoughts, our feelings clearly and respectfully, and we can have a conversation that builds trust, it builds psychological safety, and that is the speed to getting things. Be really good at communicating. And communicating clearly is one really good way of doing that. Because if I say to you, I need this by Friday, and I don't, so we need to be really honest, really trusting, being able to express when we can't do something. So I can't actually do this because of X, Y, and Z. Let's have a conversation about it. Because if we are not having the two-way communication and conversations, we are not building trust or safety in that relationship.
And we often talk about leadership, and I find what you're talking about is one of the most, or can be one of the most fulfilling parts of coaching, when you say to people, it's not what you said, it's how you said it. Getting people to understand their communication style. I mean, you've talked to me about my own communication style. I mean, we're not born perfect as coaches, and I'm certainly not in that field. But that sort of just recognizing when you shift into a passive aggressive mode rather than an assertive mode, where you've suddenly shifted from communicate to tell mode, something else we talk about. And it is really fascinating the way that when you're coaching people and they say to you, "Oh, I've had a dreadful week," "Oh, well, what's that?" "Well, this, we talked about Bob and his problem and, da, 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 da," and you go, "Yeah, we've talked about Bob before. So how's that gone then this week?" "Well, he started going off and doing this and doing that and doing the other." "And how do you approach that with him?" "Well, I sat him down and told him it was just unacceptable." "Oh, how did that conversation go?" "Well, I'm not sure he listened to me." And you go, "Yeah, and why do you think he didn't listen to you?" "Well, I don't know. You know what Bob's like. I've told you before." And you suddenly, when you start to point out their own behavior and you mirror back to them their own behavior, and you say, "Well, how would you respond to that? How would you respond to that sort of aggressive rather than sort of conversational dynamic of assertiveness?" Often that penny when it drops is remarkable. That you can suddenly see people change their whole demeanor around how they address things.
Yeah. And I think, for me, it's around, and I definitely don't get this right all the time, it's around leading with curiosity and not judgment. So what assumptions do we make before we communicate with somebody? What assumptions are we making that then bleeds into how we communicate? Because actually, if we can lead with curiosity rather than judgment, so what happens if someone hasn't turned up for something? Do we go in straight away going, "Well, they just couldn't be bothered," or do we go in with, "I wonder what else was going on for this person and let's find out"? Because we've made a story, we've made our assumptions up. So for me, one of the biggest parts of that effective communication is to not make the assumption, if you can.
Yes.
Now, we may go straight to assumption. We just need to have that moment of, I need to go in with curiosity rather than judgment, because as soon as I'm going in with curiosity, I'm giving some safe space to have a conversation. As soon as we go in with judgment, the safety has gone.
Yeah, that one of the things that I like about the safety, you use that word, is the difference between being empathetic and sympathetic. And that sort of, empathy involves understanding and sharing the feelings of another individual to seek to understand at the deepest level why it is that they are. It doesn't mean you have to sympathize with that, whereas sympathy is much more about feeling sorry for their misfortune, or in fact being envious of their fortune. And so it's a really I love, once I learned that difference between empathy and sympathy, or even learned what empathy was, I think that sort of whole psychological safety that you mentioned earlier, and being empathetic is not the same, was really enlightening for me. We're coming to the end towards it. We've got about a minute and a half left. I wondered whether there was something you wanted to end on, pick out, choose for us to sort of consider.
I think, I love the Morabian stuff. I think it's, it's making sure your tone, your body, the language is all aligned. But I think for me, effective communication is that alignment. So how do we align everything we do, and how do we create safety in having open, respectful conversations? And I use the word as conversations in a way, it's a two-way discussion. And that's what great communication is.
I can't add much to that. That's a fantastic note to conclude from. I'll add one thing. We said it's not about what you said, it's about how you said it. one of the most important things for me is always, have you checked back to make sure that how you said it was understood? And that is the one thing I would ask people to take away. Thank you very much from me, Michael Short. I've loved this again.
And thank you for
Tanya,
me.
thank you. All right. And with that, as they say, it's goodbye from me, and it's goodbye from me. All right.
Thank you.